Good morning, guys. It's Thursday, March 26th. Ooh, Unit 11, 3B, Odd Solutions. All right, so going over yesterday's assignment. Hopefully you guys all got that done, had some success. Remember, the big news here is I. That is an imaginary number, and I equals the square root of -1. Quite often when we're solving quadratic equations, we end up with a negative number under the square root, and this is just our simple way of dealing with it. We'll take out the -1 and we'll just call it I. The square root of -1 equals I, and of course that would mean I squared equals -1. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with these. When we're solving these problems, we're still using our newer technique of completing the square. So before we can solve this, we must move the 10 to the other side by adding the opposite. Now I should let you know before we go on, it would always be, first option would be to try and factor this into two binomials. That would be easier to solve. We did that quite a bit in the last unit. But a quick check of this would be, the only thing you can multiply to get 10 is 2 and 5 and 1 and 10, and neither of those will add up to -2. So we can't solve by factoring, so we have to complete the square. So I move the 10 to the other side by adding the opposite. I get x squared minus 2x. Remember, we're going to add something to make this a trinomial square. Equals -10, and if we add it on the left, we have to add it on the right as well. Half of -2 is -1, and -1 squared is 1, so we're going to add 1 to both sides. We end up with factoring this new trinomial square to x minus 1 squared equals -10 plus 1, which is -9. Take the square root of both sides. The square root of x minus 1 squared is simply x minus 1. And the square root of -9, well, we know we're going to have a plus and minus. Square root of 9 is 3, and the -1 is I. Now we add 1 to both sides. We get x equals, always put this first, 1 plus or minus 3i. Okay, moving on to number 5. All right, this one we already have the constant on this side. Now keep in mind, if I move this to the other side, it would be positive 28. So we can see, can we factor this? Can we factor this if the 28 was over here? 28 is 1 times 28, 2 times 14, and 4 times 7. There's no way to add those numbers to get -8, so we have to solve by completing the square. So x squared minus 8x plus some number equals -28 plus that same number. We're going to add it to both sides. Half of 8 is 4, and 4 squared is 16, so we're going to add 16 to both sides. This is now a trinomial squared that can be factored into x minus 4 squared equals -28 plus 16 is -12. Take the square root of both sides. The square root of x minus 4 squared is just x minus 4 equals plus or minus. Okay, now 12 can be broken up into 2 times 2 times 3. A 2 gets out, a 2 gets killed, a 3 stays in. Plus we have that -1i there, or that -1. So the 2 comes out. The square root of -1 becomes I, and the square root 3 stays in. Okay, these two got a 2 out. The negative is really just -1. It comes out as I, and the square root of 3 stays in. Our last step is to get x by itself. We add 4 to both sides, and we get x equals 4 plus or minus 2i root 3. All right, Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. Got going, I forgot to move that up. Okay, I'm not sure what you saw. So first of all, let me go over this again. So we could move the 20 to the other side and factor, but it wouldn't work. So we leave it there and we decide to add something to both sides. What are we going to add? We're going to add half of 8 squared, or negative 4 squared is 16. So we add 16 to both sides. Why do we do that? So that we can factor this trinomial into x minus 4 quantity squared. Over here we simplify negative 28 plus 16 is negative 12. Then we took the square root of both sides. The square root of x minus 4 squared is just x minus 4. The square root of negative 12, well, the negative 1 comes out as I. 12 is 2 times 3, so a 2 gets out and a 2 gets killed, and the 3 is stuck inside. Final step, we add 4 to both sides, and we get x equals 4 plus or minus 2i square root 3. Okay. All right, again, no way to factor this, so I'll subtract 20 from both sides. We get x squared minus 20x plus some number we're going to add equals negative 20 plus that same number. What are we going to add? Half of 20 is 10, and 10 squared is 100, so we're going to add 100 to both sides. This will factor into x minus half of 20 is 10 quantity squared equals, this time we get 80. So no I in our answer this time. We take the square root of both sides, and what do we have here? We have the square root of x minus 10 squared is simply x minus 10, and the square root of 80. Well, let's think about this. We have 80 is, let's go 8 times 10, right? Well, that's 2 times 2 times 2, and that's 2 times 5. So we have a set of 2's, so 1 2's getting out, 1's getting killed. We have another set of 2's, 1's getting out and 1's getting killed, and the 5 stuck inside. So 2 2's get out, so it's plus or minus 4 root 5. Last step, we add 10 to both sides, and our final answer is x equals 10 plus or minus 4 root 5. Okay. All right, now we just have some review questions. So let's see what we got here. All right, so we can simply rewrite this as 2 plus 5i plus 6 minus 7i. Now we combine like terms. 2 plus 6 is 8, and 5i plus negative 7i is negative 2i. All right, number 11, we're simply multiplying. So negative 3 times 12 is negative 36. I times I is I squared. And so that's negative 36 times negative 1. I squared equals negative 1. So our final answer is simply 36. Okay, 7 times 2 is 14. And 14 times 5 is 70. I times I times I is I to the third. So we need to remember that 70, I squared is equal to negative 1, and an I left over. So our final answer is negative 70i. Okay, now remember we're to the fifth. All right, well, let's see what we got here. Well, 2 to the fifth, we can really write this as 2 to the fifth, I to the fifth. Well, 2 to the fifth is 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16, times 2 is 32. So that's 32. Now, I to the fifth, I'm going to think of that as I squared times I squared times I. And we know that equals negative 1 and that equals negative 1, so we get basically 32 times negative 1 times negative 1 times I. Well, negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1, so this just becomes 32i. So from 32i to the fifth to 32i. because eventually these powers of I end up just repeating themselves, and I think you should have learned that yesterday. Okay, number 17. We're going to FOIL. 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times negative 3i is negative 3i. 3i times 1 is 3i. And 3i times negative 3i is negative 9i squared. These two guys cancel each other out. Negative 3i and 3i cancel. We end up with 1 minus 9i squared. That's 1 minus 9 times negative 1, which means we end up with 1 plus 9. So our final answer here is simply 10. Hey, that's the simplest answer we've had in a long time. All right, almost done here. If you remember this, reveals the maximum value of m of x. Well, that's vertex form, and that's right here, A. Reveals the zeros, the x-intercepts. Well, right there, C. And reveals the y-intercept. That's standard form right there, B. All right, guys, hope that's helpful. Hope you're doing well on this stuff. Again, email me if you need any help. Good job today.